Before we start this video, a large thank you to Zach, William, Locanus, and Lurking for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello everybody, let's start off by opening up our fire arrow script. In this video, we're going to make it so when we notch an arrow, we're going to have it synced across multiplayer, so in the next video we can fire the arrow. So we're going to need a little bit of work. First, let's say if character dot is not holding arrow on the fire arrow action, let's return. Otherwise, you're going to be able to fire an arrow when you're not actually holding one. So let's then go back into the project here. You can see I have a target aim transform while aiming on my player model. We actually never assigned that when we refactored a camera. So go to the assign camera to player function, and then we want to say target transform while aiming is equal to player dot, and then I don't think we have a variable for that. No, we don't. So let's go ahead and make one. I'm just going to place mine on the player manager right under the camera header. Going to make it public, and the variable type is transform, and I'm going to call it target transform whilst aiming. Now, I think I followed my whole naming convention plan ages ago of naming the game object the same thing as the variable, so I should just be able to search this in the player's hierarchy and just drag it in there and it should work. So I think ranged or archery might be a little bit broken because we've changed some systems and this was done a long time ago. It probably still works, but it might need some modification. So if I go in here and I draw the arrow, yes, that is working as intended. I'm aiming. Okay, looks pretty good. I shoot it and it is stuck into my characters. So yeah, that's no good. All right, that's an easy fix. We just need to ignore the colliders for the character. I think we did this before we had a bunch of individual damage colliders maybe. Maybe that's why it's not working as intended. But easy fix. All we do is go to the fire arrow, and right after we instantiate the arrow, you want to make an array of colliders, and we'll call this character colliders. And these are all the colliders on the character that's shooting the arrow. So we're going to say this is equal to character.getComponents in children collider. And then all you want to do is grab the collider of the arrow. And I believe I'm using a capsule collider on my live arrow. You could just use a regular collider variable if you want. Doesn't really matter. So we can just say right here collider. We can call this range projectile collider or arrow collider, whatever you want to call it, is equal to live arrow.getComponent collider. And then we just iterate through every single character collider, and we make it ignore collisions with the range projectile collider, effectively making it so you can't shoot yourself. So we're going to say for each character collider inside of character colliders, as in the array, we're going to do physics.ignore collision, and we're going to compare it with the range projectile collider, and then we're going to say true. It's, I believe, defaultly set to true anyway, but I'm just going to put the bool there just in case. And this means it's going to, yes, ignore every single collision between these two colliders. And now we go to the game, draw the arrow, and now if I shoot it, yes, it is back to working as intended and as it used to. So we have to unfortunately change a lot of stuff here, and not really unfortunately, I'd rather reseed it. No logic is going to change. We just need to basically change some stuff to network variables, and we need to make an on value changed event for having the arrow notch. So it's just going to be a lot of correcting, as is the case when switching from single player to multiplayer. So let's go over now and let's take our is aiming and is holding arrow variables here on the character manager. Let's delete them. And let's bring them over to the character network manager, and then just like in the last couple of videos, we're going to have to go through each of these errors and basically just change where we're calling this from, because now it is seated on a different place, and now it is a network variable, so we have to use the dot value as well, or else it's going to give you an error. So what are we doing here? So while I go through and correct these, I'm going to explain it to you guys. So we have two ways of initializing an arrow projectile in Unity for Netcode that's effective. Actually, before I do that, I'll make one note here. Is holding arrow, we're not setting that from the animator anymore. We're setting the animator from our character network manager. So it will actually be animator.setBool is holding arrow, and we pass the value of our character network manager. So reverse that. That's the only change. Everything else is just filling in blanks and correcting where you need to call it from. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So basically, you could just initialize the arrow as a network object and then track its location. But here's why I don't do that. And I'm sure it's fine, but here's why I don't do that. I'm going to show you both ways. I'll show you that way and I'll show you my way. So if I instantiate an arrow as a network object and I'm tracking the location of it, when I shoot you in my client, you might be like maybe a third of a meter to the right on my screen compared to where you are on your screen. And I know that doesn't seem like much, but when you're dealing with really fast traveling projectiles, I tend to notice it a little bit. So here's what I do. I bank the location that I'm aiming when I shoot the arrow by comparing the rotation of my camera and the direction of my player. And then I use a server RPC to actually instantiate the arrow, and I pass those values so the arrow shoots at the exact location, the exact same location, in your client as it does in my client, regardless of where you're standing or I'm standing or where I'm facing. And I find this works best. And to give another addition to that, when I'm locked on to you, I don't sync my rotation across the network. I let your game handle my character's rotation by forcing it to rotate towards you. Why do I do this? Well, like I said, if there's like a half a second delay and I'm facing you on my screen because I'm locked onto you, if you have to wait to get my rotation, then it'll always look like I'm facing a little bit away from you if there's a bit of lag. So when we're locked on, we're also going to handle it so we're just going to rotate the character locally so there's no lag. If you don't know what that means right now, don't worry about it. We're going to get into it in its own video, but for those of you who understand what I'm saying, you can go ahead and implement that now if you'd like, but we are going to cover it. So basically, what I'm getting at here is there's times when you want to sync the network transform all the time, and then there's times where you want to let the movement play out locally. Another good example of that is if I'm jumping in the air and landing, I don't want to sync the network transform every frame because the land is going to look a little bit almost stuttery. It's going to play the landing animation too early, and it's going to fall not at the speed that our gravity would dictate. So when we're in the air or falling, we almost want to let that play out locally as well. We have to put a buffer in place though to make sure we don't become too distinct, so we'll handle that as well. So Netcode, there's a lot of little small things you can do to really make the movement and the mechanics feel a lot more polished. It's not always just syncing a variable online, although that is the case some of the time. It's just that simple. Okay, how many more we got here? Like 5. If is holding arrow, dot value is equal to true. So yeah, the goal of this video here now is to, at the end of this, we're going to sync two-handedness, and we're going to sync the arrow being notched so that if a character does notch an arrow, you're going to see the arrow and the bow animation and the draw animation play properly because the bow has its own animator, and we're going to need to sync that as well. We're not going to make it a network object. We're just going to use a server RPC. And apologies if you guys hear my dog running around in the background. I'm actually out of my office right now because there's an electrical problem, so I have my setup down in my living room until it's getting fixed. So my dogs are down here just kind of running around in circles. All right, let's save that. That looks good. Save that. Now, over here on the draw arrow action, what we want to do is change character.animator.setBool to character.character.networkmanager.isHoldingArrow.value equal to true. So we're no longer changing the animator, we're changing the isHoldingArrow bool. And the same thing here down here. Do the same thing. Change that to isHoldingArrow.value is equal to true. And this is on the fire arrow action. Let's save that. Now if we go into the game here now, and I go over to my second client, you can see here, if I two-hand my bow on the client, back on the host, if I look over here, I'm not two-handing the bow. So we just got to sync if we're two-handing or not, and that's pretty easy. Just erase the is two-handing weapon bool from the player or character manager, go to your character network manager and make it a network bool, and that's basically it. It should work as intended after you've corrected all the errors of redirecting where the bool needs to be referenced. It's just that simple for this. So again, let's just put this here and save it. Defaultly, it's obviously set to false, and you can read it, but only the owner can write it. So now we have all these errors, so just go here now, and the same thing as before. There's no special case here, just make sure you're redirecting it to the character network manager, and then you say is two-handing weapon.value, and that's it. So because basically this bool directs which locomotions that we play, there's nothing that needs to be done further. The animator will do the work from here. Just correct it where the corrections need to be. So I'm just going to keep this playing. I know people would prefer if I didn't cut anything out, so I'm just going to go through every single one of these here now and just correct them. If you want to fast forward, go for it. Because the next thing we're going to do is create a server RPC for actually notching our arrow, and we're going to change our fire arrow, or rather our draw arrow, function just a little bit. So we have an item action right now for draw arrow, and what we're going to do is we're basically going to make it so that when the has arrow notched bool is changed, or I think we called it is holding arrow in this project, when the is holding arrow network variable is changed, we're going to use the on value changed event like we did before, and we're going to make it so if the case is true, so yes, if there is an arrow notched, then we're going to fire a server RPC, which will then fire a client RPC, which will then make our player model on everybody's game notch an arrow with their bow. So it'll be pretty straightforward. Now there's a special case where if you join the game, if somebody already has their bow notched, we'll have to do something else, but it's very simple. You basically just want to check for some parameters when you're joining, and then when you join, for example, if we join and a character already has an arrow notched, we'll just call the server RPC, or rather the direct function for them then. But Again, not important right now. I will get into it. So if this doesn't make sense to you, don't stress out about it. But if it does make sense to you, you can go ahead and implement that now too if you'd like. So I'm going to go and just keep correcting these. I think we're almost done. And after this, we can go and create the server RPC. And I'm going to split this into two parts because it's quite long, and because I'm showing you guys two different ways of how to instantiate and fire the arrow, because honestly, one use case might work better for your project than the other. If your project is strictly a Souls-like, and you really want to have a very accurate representation of where the arrow is going to be, I would highly recommend doing it the way I do it. But if your project is more general, or your combat is more, I'm going to say loose, then you can do it the other way as well. Archery is a bit strange because there's three ways really to fire an arrow. There's the aimed variant, and then there's the lock-on, and then there's the free aim. So the lock-on is actually going to have a different server RPC than the free aim. And the aimed could even have a different server RPC too if you wanted it to, but the way we have it set up, it doesn't need to. Lock-on is very straightforward. You always direct the arrow towards your lock-on target's position. But when you're aiming, it's a little bit different. We have to bank the rotation of the camera, basically the way it's rotated up and down, and then the way our character's facing, so we can kind of get which angle the arrow has to come out and become instantiated and fire at, because that location that the arrow has aimed has to be consistent across everybody's client. It's not hard, it's a little bit different. It's very straightforward once you see it written out, and it makes a lot of sense. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 left. Okay, so is two-handing weapon dot value true, save 4. This one is on all weapon actions. Yeah, so we're referencing is two-handing weapon a lot on our weapon actions. That makes sense. Our light attacks, our heavy attacks, your aiming action, etc., etc. Is two-handing weapon dot value is equal to true, save 1, 2 left. This one is on the handle two-handed input. Is two-handing weapon dot value is two-handing weapon dot value. Okay, we're good. Now, let's test this before we move on. So I'm going to go into the game here, and if I two-hand the bow on the other client, yes, it works. Excellent. So now that should work for your regular weapons too. But now you can see if I try to draw an arrow, I play the animation, but the bow doesn't animate, and we don't have an arrow notch. So this part's actually pretty straightforward, very simple. We're just going to use the server RPC again. You can see here I have a bool for is holding arrow, and it is set to true, so that's not the problem here. But what we want to do is basically run the logic that we're running locally, run it on a server RPC. So if we go to draw arrow, the draw arrow action script, what we want to do first is actually make an ID for the arrow that we're drawing. So let's make a public network variable of type int. That's initialized at 0, and you can call this held arrow ID or loaded projectile or notched projectile ID, whatever makes the most sense to you, but this is going to be for arrows strictly. So I'm going to call it held arrow ID, and I'm going to initialize it at 0. And what we want to do is when we're actually drawing an arrow, we want to set that value to the arrow's item ID. So what I'm going to do, right below the animate the player comment, I'm going to say character.character network manager dot held arrow ID dot value is equal to character.character inventory manager, and I believe we call that ammo, ranged ammo, perhaps current ammo dot item ID. Okay, so now everything below that, even when we play the bow animation, copy it, and we're going to move it. So everything below where you're getting your character to play the draw animation. And then let's go over to the character network manager, and let's make an on value changed event here. So let's call it public void on has arrow notched. And then we're going to have this require two bools, one for the old status and one for the new status, and then just paste that logic in here. And then inside this now, we can actually change the new status if you wanted to has arrow notched. But I'm just going to say if new status, as in if we do have an arrow notched. So if the new status is true, that means if yes, the arrow is notched. And just to be super clear, I'm going to rename this because it's not very clear. So if has arrow notched, then we're going to run this logic. Now we can call this on our on network spawn. So let's go to our player manager and make sure you call it outside of if is owner, because we want this to be called for everybody. So basically, if I change my is arrow notched on my client, it's going to run this function on your client for my game object. So make sure it's outside if is owner. Player network manager dot, and we're going to go to has arrow notched or is holding arrow, sorry, dot value plus equals player network manager dot has or on has arrow notched. And that's supposed to be on value change. That's my bad, not dot value. Okay, so now every single time we change that bool, it's going to run that function. And if we have the bool set to true, it's going to run the logic in that function. Now, if we test this, this should work. So on my client here, I'm going to two-hand and draw an arrow, and yes, it works. So you can see now the arrow has instantiated, and it works as intended. But we can do a couple more things. We can't actually fire the arrow yet. If you were to do that, then it would just play the launch animation, and then the arrow would actually go nowhere. So in the next episode, we're going to cover multiple ways to fire this arrow. As always, guys, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next episode when we actually shoot this projectile.